Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the latest in our series of forums in preparation of developing our state plans for implementing our federal and state broadband funding. We wanted to take a session to address two components that are factors in our federal grants and federal plans, but where we really want to be working in partnership with internet service providers and the entire industry, and that is related to network resiliency and cybersecurity. Very fortunate to have our key state colleagues representing the Department of Environmental Conservation, Mark Lowry, and our Chief Cyber Officer, Colin Ahern, to discuss these items, and we'll leave some time for Q&A. I'm Joshua Breitbart. I'm the Senior Vice President for Connect All. Hopefully the Connect All does not need a further introduction since we've had a number of these forums. But again, this is an important consideration for us as we look to make this once in a lifetime investment in future-proof infrastructure for the state of New York. So I'm just going to go briefly through the minimum requirements that are in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for our funding. And then we'll get into the presentation. So with respect to resiliency and mitigating climate change, we have to account for current and future weather and climate risks for these projects. In many cases, we know that this might be a consideration of why it's been challenging to build infrastructure in certain areas, and we certainly want to get the most out of this investment. So the things that we're required to do at a minimum level are identify the geographic areas that should be subject to certain hazard screenings, identify the hazards that are most important to account for in these areas, identify approaches to mitigating those risks, and detail a plan to periodically repeat this process over the life of the program to address revolving risks. Now, again, these are the requirements that we have to provide in our initial proposal for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. But this is an opportunity for us to hear from you what factors to consider. And the key thing to keep in mind from my perspective and from the perspective of the Connect All office is, we want to understand what the key trade-offs are, what the cost impacts may be of addressing these, and so that we have a way to address them in the course of the plan, so that ideally nobody who makes further investments in resilience measures is getting essentially penalized from a cost standpoint. So it's critically important that we hear what the baseline requirements should be, what additional approaches should be, and how that should be considered on a geographic basis, or the approach of certain construction methods or architectures. Next slide. So some of the examples of weather and climate threat mitigations would include choice of technology platform, reliance on approach to siting, underground versus aerial, how you might retrofit or harden certain assets. Backup power, of course, is always a consideration. Use of redundancies, and the use of established plans and processes to deal with extreme weather-related risks. So again, we're going to hear from the perspective of the state what the key risks are, and then we're going to want to hear from you what are some of the approaches that you're taking, and how should the state give weight to those and value the approaches that you are taking, what the best practices are. So I think next slide. So with that, I would introduce Mark Lowry, Assistant Director of the Office of Climate Change, to review those climate threats. Mark?
Thank you, Josh. I want to thank you and your colleagues at Empire State Development for inviting our office to participate in the planning for these investments. My task this morning is to essentially set the stage for input from the providers by providing, in the very limited amount of time I have, some very brief thumbnail sketches of the climate hazards that we feel are most likely to affect telecommunications infrastructure. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. And just to set a little more background, in response to the trend that we have seen in increasing losses due to floods, and in particular the damage and death caused by Tropical Storm Lee and Hurricanes Irene and Sandy back in 2011 and 2012, New York State enacted the Community Risk and Resiliency Act of 2014. This law required, among a lot of other things, that applicants for permits for major projects in a small number of DEC regulatory programs demonstrate that they considered future physical risks due to sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding in their project siting and design. But then in 2019, New York State enacted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. The primary focus of the CLCPA is to set greenhouse gas emission limits, but it also made significant amendments to the original language of the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, so that applicants for major permits are required to, all major permits are required to demonstrate consideration of all climate hazards. Now, I suspect that most telecommunications infrastructure will not require a major permit, but the guidance that I will refer to later is applicable to in other instances beyond application for a permit for a major project. There will also note that CARA, the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, requires that any agency that funds public infrastructure to consider risk due to sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding specifically. Next slide, please. The surest effect of global warming is an increase in average temperatures. Perhaps more significant in infrastructure planning will be the increase in frequency of extreme heat events, and heat waves as a frequency distribution of average heats shifts to the right. We have certainly seen the result of that kind of shift over the past couple of months around the world. The total number of individual hot days and the annual frequency and duration of heat waves in New York State are expected to increase as the century progresses. The capital region data here are from 2014, and I'll note that data soon to be released will likely show a substantial increase in the projected frequency of extreme heat days. Next slide, please. New York State can expect to see an increase in average annual precipitation, but again, perhaps more significantly, at least in terms of flooding. And here in New York, we are concerned about both pluvial flooding and fluvial being stormwater-related flooding in streets and so forth, and fluvial meaning riverine flooding. We have seen a significant shift in the pattern of precipitation, and I won't take the time to explain this complicated figure, but the point is that heavy precipitation events are becoming more frequent and more intense across most of the United States, but particularly in the Northeast, leading to increased risk associated with, again, both pluvial and fluvial flooding. Next slide, please. Looking to our tidal coast, we see increasing rates of sea level rise. The long-term trend at the Battery at the southern end of Manhattan has averaged a rate of rise of not quite a foot per century over the long term, but the more recent trend is almost double that rate of rise as waters warm and continue to expand, and the pace of melt of land-based ice, glaciers and ice on Greenland and Antarctica has increased dramatically, again, a trend that is expected to continue. I'll also note that we expect sea level rise to be expressed not only on Long Island and the New York City area, but all the way up the Hudson River to the federal dam at Troy. Next slide, please. Sea level rise, as we all know, can have damaging permanent effects even in the absence of storms. So-called sunny day flooding occurs when now higher sea level, when now high tides reach areas that were formerly dry. And we are already seeing such flooding 1 or 2 times a month in some areas of Staten Island, Queens, the South Shore of Long Island, and even along the Hudson River. Further, even minor but repeated flooding can cause damage to important infrastructure and spread chemical contamination from polluted sites into the neighborhood. Next slide, please. As ocean waters rise, they exert more hydrostatic pressure, which can result in a rising water table, that is the elevation of the groundwater, and resulting in the emergence of ponds, ephemeral ponds at first, but eventually permanent ponds in our coastal areas, as well as an increase in the salinity of groundwater due to saltwater intrusion. And this is, again, something that's already being observed in places like Long Island. Next slide, please. New York State has a set of official state sea level rise projections that were adopted in 2017 pursuant to the Community Risk and Resiliency Act. We are in the process of revising those projections. They are in a regulation, Part 490 of DEC's regulations. And I'll note for this purpose that our current 2050s projections, the medium projection, which and we are currently have been tracking, the observed sea level rise has been tracking consistent with the medium sea level rise projections that we adopted in 2017. Our current 2050s projections, medium projection is ranges from 14 to 18 inches for the New York State tidal coast, with a high projection of 21 to 25 inches. So installation of infrastructure along the tidal coast should take those projections into consideration, again, in siting and design. Next slide, please. We anticipate that future storm surge by the end of this century, sea level rise alone will contribute to a significant increase in large coastal floods, both in the aerial extent and the depth of coastal flooding. It's projected, again, by the end of this century, but certainly by the 2050s, we'll be well on our way, that coastal flood levels that currently occur approximately once per decade may occur once every 1 to 3 years. That is 3 to 10 times more frequently than we have been seeing them historically. And that flooding at the level currently associated with our 100-year, so-called 100-year coastal flood may occur about 4 times as often by the end of this century. But we also believe that dangerous storm surges that are usually caused by high winds during storms, fueled by warmer water temperatures, will increase the risk of flooding, beach erosion, and damage to infrastructure in low-lying areas, even more than we would experience as a result of sea level rise alone, although this risk has not yet been quantified. But we have certainly seen the effects during events such as the very high storm surge during Hurricane Sandy. Next slide, please. DEC, as I mentioned, the Community Risk and Resiliency Act required DEC to issue guidance on implementation of that law. We did so by issuing guidance in 2020. This flood risk management guidance is intended to provide non-binding technical guidance to agencies and program units that are responsible for the programs referenced in CARA, but it also recommends flood management guidelines for each of a variety of building and infrastructure types. Agencies, units, and others that are responsible for infrastructure design and siting, as well as review of that siting and design, would incorporate those recommended guidelines into program-specific guidance and perhaps operating regulations, consistent with each program's authorizing statute and risk tolerance. Next slide, please. The guidance document is based, the guideline elevations are based on Executive Order 13690, which was issued by the Obama administration, rescinded by the Trump administration, but put back into place by the Biden administration, and consistent with that executive order at the federal level, includes the use of a climate-informed science elevation to define the future floodplain. But the executive order did not provide guidance on how that should be done. Our guidance does. the climate-informed science guideline that we recommend for calculating a flood risk management elevation consists of 3 components: the based flood elevation or other applicable design criterion, a climate change component, which could be sea level rise, projected sea level rise, or an increment related to increased flood levels based on increased precipitation, and extending this elevation to its intersection with the ground. So addressing that risk, flood risk that is not captured by FEMA's flood maps, that essentially is the risk of flooding at the areas adjacent to but not in FEMA's map special flood hazard areas. And the guidance documents that we've produced describe how this should be applied, as well as gives examples and information sources that engineers and floodplain managers can use to identify these climate-informed science flood risk management guidelines. Next slide, please. Again, we have provided step-by-step guidance on how to calculate these elevations, and there are a variety of online resources available, including sea level rise mappers and a number of others that are data sources that can be used. Next slide, please. And this is my final. I will close with this caution. We tend to think about climate hazards in the singular, and that is certainly the way I've talked about them today. But very often these hazards arrive in 2s or 3s and have cascading effects, something that those involved in telecommunications planning need to consider, especially given the conductivity between telecommunications and energy infrastructure. We know, as an example, that towns along the Hudson River are threatened by floods that are caused by heavy precipitation that are made worse by sea level rise. And these floods are often accompanied by high winds or lightning. Our response to Sandy was slowed because power stations were flooded, so the gas stations could not pump. And as you may recall, at Breezy Point, 127 homes were lost to fires sparked by downed and flooded electrical wires, while firefighters watched helplessly, unable to navigate flooded streets and bridges. So we have to think carefully about these interacting hazards and cascading events as well. With that, I think next slide has some contact information, but I will close there. Thank you.
Okay, let's just take a second, because that is a lot to absorb. And, it's, the point of this conversation is really to go into this effort with our eyes wide open. I also just want to acknowledge that, all the, events and many others, just, any snowstorm are the things that many of you all and your workforce are managing, for years. And we just want to acknowledge that that is incredibly difficult and challenging work, and it's likely to get more challenging based on what Mark just presented. So again, the Connect All office is really looking to be a partner to industry in addressing this, and we'd like to just open the floor with some Q&A and discussion on these topics. For any of you, share what region you're working in and what are some of the biggest resiliency threats that you're facing, and any actions that you're taking to mitigate these risks, and whether those the challenges you face in taking those actions. And by the way, we'll also be following up at the end of this session with a survey, so you can add some additional information that way. But we appreciate opening the floor to any observations. And many of you have been in these forums before, I will call on people if I have to. Jim, can I call on you? Jim Becker? Would you mind sharing a little bit of your experience, dealing with, weather events and how you see that changing over time?
Sure. I just joined. I'm sorry. Just got out of a
Okay.
different meeting, so missed the precursor to that, but absolutely can talk about weather events, unfortunately. Being here for 100 years plus and dealing with these events throughout the decades that we have, there has been some sort of natural, no pun intended there, natural resiliency and some sort of geography things that we've just done out of our experiences. And I guess we needed to, like, in a sense. So part of that is making sure our buildings are out of the floodplains, being a little more resilient in flood prone like areas by putting stuff in the ground and off the poles and those types of things. And then it's also being ready for those floods, right? Disaster preparedness. We have our manuals and all those types of things, but been through it enough times now that we sort of know the drill. But it's making sure that your generators are fueled, your contacts with local officials are up to date, keeping them like up to date, working with the power companies, and just having that sort of flow. So once the power company has cleared an area, we can get in there, or you can get in there as soon as possible. So I think it's just making sure you do have a plan to work those things. But from a network standpoint, it's good to think about those things. Flooding, and we have some ice storms up here sometimes. Those are really the big two, and maybe like a twister or two that comes through, but that's normally a smaller swath. And Josh, if I didn't answer the question, please can share.
No, I appreciate it, and appreciate you jumping straight in. Yeah, Lee, I appreciate your perspective. I know Heffley TV has a slightly different history, but do you want to bring that point? Just I can read it out from the chat. It says we have flooding in Spencer, New York. The town has had difficulty getting state permits to clean creeks. Could the state permit process be streamlined? It's obviously a question I don't know the answer to, but it's it's a great point that there may be other mitigations to address that. I don't know, Mark, if that's something you've dealt with, or Lee, if you want to speak to that a bit more.
I'm not, and I'll give an answer that I think is consistent with the state, with DEC's position, in that when municipal officials talk about cleaning creeks, frankly, that often means recreational bulldozing in protected areas, and does not necessarily lead to to a decrease in flood risk. And so they look at these things on a case-by-case basis and make that determination. And obviously, I can't speak to the specifics, but there are concerns that, for instance, what's been explained to me, if you go in and simply, again, cleaning a creek often means deepening it in some people's minds, but that then increases the velocity of the water and increases the erosion potential. So we have to be very careful about what we do in those creeks. What may seem obvious to some isn't so obvious to the experts.
Thank you. Can anybody speak to any shifts in your approach to aerial deployment versus subsurface construction, and how that plays out in relation to different weather related events? If that's something that you've seen change over time in terms of your own cost benefit analysis for the total cost of ownership and mitigation over time.
So Josh, it's Jim again. I can speak to a little bit about that. I mentioned it in my preamble there, or my rambling before, and there are certain areas in our network that are more prone to flooding, and we have tried to bury those areas, as we've experienced 2 or 3 or more times of the pole line being wiped out. It doesn't completely mitigate the risk, because it can also erode away the bank or erode away the area where we are buried. But we're also looking at it now as we move ahead, where the cost to deploy the aerial is getting pretty close to the cost to bury. And so we have looked at maybe additional areas as we expand, where it does make sense to bury and get you away from those operational costs and those make ready costs as well.
And I don't know, perhaps this is a really question for anybody, but I see, a number of different operators on. How is the, increase in heat events impacting the workforce? I think that's one of the concerns, since the work has to be done outdoors, as extreme heat increases, that increases risk for workforce. How does that have an impact for any of your planning or procedures? Is that something that Frontier is dealing with, Jennifer?
I don't know that it's new, Josh. But I think probably like most providers, we're all having issues sometimes in, retaining workforce, attracting them. This is hard work. I mean, it's outdoors, you're climbing poles, it's hot, it's cold, it's freezing, it's rainy. And I think as you have more people working in an office job, so to say, I know, having also worked in oil and gas before I came to telecom, the experience the same thing, is that when kids don't grow up with examples of, mothers, fathers, aunts and uncles, grandparents working outdoors all the time, it becomes less attractive for them as they grow up and they're seeking careers. So it's hard to attract people and keep these things. And of course, like many places, we have an aging workforce who at some point don't want to be out sweating to death or freezing to death or climbing poles. And if I could just jump on, a point that Jim was making earlier about deployment, I think also it depends on the community, with aerial underground. I mean, it's lovely to go in underground when ahead of time, like in a new development, let's say, that's going in. But, communities don't enjoy having their streets ripped up to put in something and then waiting a while, for the drop berries, to be resolved. So there's while being considerate, and trying to mitigate the risks and deal with the environment, there's also the push-pull of, how speedy do we want the deployment to get to the unserved and the underserved, communities that we're all trying so desperately to connect.
Yeah, exactly why we're looking for all of your input to consider what to balance, how to balance, these factors. Does anybody else want to jump in or move to the next slide? I think we got two more questions. Right, or does that go straight to the next session?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say we are preparing for the winds and rain from possible Hurricane Lee, depending on which way it wobbles. So we're doing all those things we just talked about.
Yeah. And so as we think about, and again, any thoughts right now are appreciated. In the follow-up survey we'll send out, or in the weeks ahead. But are there certain measures that should be required, or how should we again, account for the way this impacts the business case in certain areas? How can Connect All help you be more prepared as we design our grant programs?
For us, if we could have fiber optics under the water between us and Connecticut, that's our challenge. Because right now we're only microwave only.
And you're on Fisher Island, is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. We talked about that. Well, we can reconnect. I did have a conversation with a colleague in Connecticut about it, so we should
all right,
we can chat.
Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, thanks.
But I think that those are considerations also. In some cases, a wireless overlay might be a resilience measure, but it can cut both ways. Any other thoughts? Again, we want to be balanced about what we might require, while being judicious in the use of the limited, significant but limited amount of federal funds we have here. Any other thoughts on how we can help ISPs be prepared? Is there technical assistance, further support? Is there information that Mark shared that would that's helpful to incorporate as you plan to make new investments or request public support for infrastructure that's going to last for decades, or that we certainly intend to last for decades? Okay, well, again, this is, as you saw from the minimum requirements that are in the federal grant, this is an exercise that is meant to be ongoing, where we continually reassess. And so, expect this to be an ongoing conversation. Again, further input, either in the chat or in follow-up would be much appreciated. Let's shift to the second portion of our forum, looking at cybersecurity requirements. Frankly, these requirements are, from both perspectives, for both of these, we just look at them as minimum requirements. But the governor is committed to facing both of these areas of challenge head on. In this case, what the federal government requires is that all ISPs have a risk management plan in place that is either operational or ready to be operationalized, that it meets sort of current industry standards and industry practices based on the established frameworks. That'll be reevaluated and updated on a periodic basis, and that'll be available to be submitted to the state. Now, this again doesn't go into great detail. So what we want to do today is hear from Colin Aaron, New York's chief cyber officer, about some of the state's overarching approach, and then we'll get into, are there additional considerations or details or forms of support Connect All or the state can provide to better prepare the telecommunications networks. Colin?
Hey, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. My camera's not working, so apologies. Apologies on that. Next slide, please. So I want to start off with a quote from the governor. There is a new type of emerging risk that threatens our daily lives. Just as we improve our physical infrastructure in the aftermath of 9/11, we must now transform how we approach cybersecurity. And obviously, as we just heard from DEC, these are serious long-term issues. Both of these issues. And so obviously there's no easy button here. There's no secret, just requires, resources and time and effort, etc. Next slide, please. But let's talk first about the threats. And really the theme of the last several years has been convergence. Historically, there were three kinds of groups. One you'd call cyber criminals, those that are financially motivated, those that digital smash and grab, ransomware, which has been evolving. But historically, there's been, the most prevalent and significant threat to especially businesses were criminal actors, people that steal data and they want to monetize that data. They want money. The second were nation states with intelligence goals and military goals and other things that primarily targeted, at least historically, other government networks. And then third would be hacktivists, or ideologically or politically motivated or racially motivated threat actors. And that would be, 400-pound guy in your basement, website defacement, etc. So historically, and this is kind of before really the 2018 phase, as you guys all remember, there was, the governments would worry about governments, and business would worry about criminals. And really everyone was sort of somewhat concerned about the lone actor. Certainly that could be an issue, but really wasn't as ever present. Now, historically, it's all mixed. Everything's getting mixed together. So you have nation states that are fronting criminal groups, especially the Russians and the Chinese. And you have ideologically motivated groups being quote unquote astroturfed. So they appear to be that they're alone. They appear to be individually motivated. But in fact, they are not. They are really acting at the behest of the foreign government. And then obviously the criminals, because of their increasingly pernicious relationships with foreign governments, are getting the tools of foreign governments. So whereas previously the cyber defenses that a government needed, the cyber defenses that a company needed, the cyber defenses that a small business needed were really very distinct because they face very different threats. That's not true anymore. And so if your impression as a business owner is that it's been getting more significant, you're right. And this are FBI complaints over the past 5 years. And obviously you see complaints going up, kind of going up, but losses dramatically increasing over the last 5 years, really because of this phenomenon. And these are just the losses that we know about. Obviously, we know the losses in reality are much more significant. So the magnitude and the complexity of these threats is getting more significant. And obviously, you guys all read the news. It's just getting more and more significant. Geopolitical tensions, cross China Strait, Russia's disastrous war of choice in the Ukraine, and other things really make us think that we need to take even more seriously cybersecurity issues. Next slide. So the state has a strategy, which that picture was from the announcement of our strategy. I have one in my hands. You can hear the paper rustling, perhaps. I was going to lift it up and show all of you. But we have really the governor's strategy is outlined by 3 core values. Number 1, that we are unified. We work to increase access to cybersecurity information, cybersecurity tools, and cybersecurity services so that our most sophisticated defenses are available to our least resource entities. 2, that we're resilient, including by expanding the scope of cybersecurity regulations, requirements, and recommendations so that our critical infrastructure is better protected. Obviously, as you all know, if there's no communications, there's big issues, right? So communications is, all critical infrastructure is critical, but maybe like animal farms, some are more critical than others. And communications, obviously, especially increasingly broadband and other things, are fundamental, really building block critical infrastructure, in addition to obviously water and power and some other things. And that also that we're prepared because the state, the federal, and the local governments need to continue to provide advice and guidance to ensure that New Yorkers are empowered to take charge of their own cybersecurity. And we want to ensure that our cyber defense is greater than the sum of its parts. We know that this is a team sport. We can either fail separately or succeed together. There isn't a universe in which we will independently succeed all on our own. So we know that these are collective public, private, and individual responsibilities, and often breaches that span thousands and thousands of devices and networks come down to a single open email, a single open file. And we know that everyone has a role to play. Obviously, there's things in the news we're watching very closely today. Obviously, MGM has got a very significant cyber event, as you guys have probably seen in the news, or we're watching on New York One, or for those in the 5 rails today. People can't even get into hotel rooms because now there are computer systems that control the key cards in the doors. So the physical, the growth and pervasiveness of digital systems continues to advance even more quickly, and that makes being unified, being resilient, being prepared even more important. Next slide, please. So we have 5 strategic pillars, and I'll just spend maybe a couple of minutes on each one. And then obviously happy to use the balance of the time to take questions. So the first strategic pillar is that we must operate state government networks securely and resiliently while we deliver services and function efficiently. We are continuing to work to consolidate and update our information technology infrastructure, our operations, and our policy, like I'm sure many of you do day in and day out. We want to continue to focus our efforts on these with expanding our defensive capabilities, taking advantage of the new tools that emerge in the marketplace. We want to modernize state networks, in particular, in accordance with zero trust best practices, and addressing legacy technology, which, as you all know, that have been providing services for many, many years. It's just there is legacy technology that is an issue that needs to be addressed. Obviously, we have several other things that we're also doing kind of in this bucket. We have security operations and defensive technologies. We're tracking risk. And we continue to issue updated policies for our state agencies. Number two, collaborating with key stakeholders, including city, county, tribal, local governments, private sector partners, nonprofits, et cetera, and really with the goal of increasing cybersecurity resilience across the state. And kind of first and foremost, the state provides services. That's what the state does. And we provide cybersecurity services primarily to county and local governments because we think that the resources and expertise required to defend against cyber criminals in nation states, which has evolved like we just spoke about, demands a greater challenge for local governments that might be unable to obtain leading edge products and hire dedicated staff. So we've taken steps, most principally in the last budget that the governor signed in May, just a couple months ago, to augment the cybersecurity of county and local governments in order to raise our overall posture. The Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services has a cyber incident response team that supports local governments, non-executive agencies, and public authorities by providing free proactive services, including risk assessments, phishing training, tabletop exercise, capability workshops, and other things. Last year, as many of you probably know, we initiated a really first in the nation program to provide shared services directly to county and local governments. And this program started with one service, and that's endpoint detection and response. We partnered with a firm known as CrowdStrike to provide this at no net incremental license cost to county and select local governments around the state, the largest 5 municipalities outside of New York City. And that enables us to automatically share information with the statewide Security Operations Center, with the New York State Intelligence Center, and with the Division of Homeland Security where appropriate, and agreed to by the participants really for the first time, so that we can incorporate malicious cyber activity that is targeting county and local governments directly and in near real time into an overall threat picture and work even more closely with those governments. And obviously moving forward, we want to expand the kinds of services we provide. The governor made a public commitment in the event last year to explore attack surface management, which is, taking a bad guy's eye view of government infrastructure so that we can help prioritize a set of limited resources in addressing vulnerabilities. Pillar 3, regulating critical infrastructure. Obviously, I should mention, obviously, providing and administering grants is a fundamental part of our stakeholder analysis strategy, and is really the reason we're here today. But Pillar 3 regulation, really the state has, explicit regulatory authority via the Public Service Commission, as you all know. And the governor signed additional legislation in 2022, creating strongest in the nation's cybersecurity protections for the energy grid. And this legislation required energy distribution utilities to prepare for cyber attacks the same way they do for storms in their annual emergency response plans. It also provided the Public Service Commission with additional and enhanced auditing powers. And we continue to work, obviously, most principally with the Department of Energy, with American FERC, and other federal bodies on the implementation of this new legislation. As you all know, the financial sector has long been one of the avenues in which the state exercises really nation-leading regulatory authority via the New York State Department of Financial Services. There is a new DFS set of cyber regs that is actually out for its third round of comment that closes in just a week or so. So do check that out if you're interested. And we'll continue to, level the playing field, not, synchronize our regulations to the extent that it is feasible with other sets of regulations across the United States and other things. And kind of moving rapidly to the last two, Pillar 4, communicating cybersecurity advice and guidance. Obviously, we do basically two things here. One, fostering communities of practice, much like the set of practices and communities we're engaging with today. And also we issue cybersecurity hygiene guidance via a number of avenues: state homeland security, the state IT office, et cetera, et cetera. And last, and certainly not least, growing New York cyber workforce and economy. We have a number of efforts underway to expand our talent pool, both to make New York State a preferred hiring destination for companies and institutions, and to ensure that state agencies and other governments can hire and retain the personnel that they need. And, we're continuing to invest in the state university system, community colleges, City University of New York, and others to ensure that cybersecurity talent and businesses can rely on this important public institution to train their workforce. And we're making significant expansions in several student institutions to make them high-tech hubs, federal research funding, lab facilities, partnerships. We have 4 community colleges, for example, around the state that are DoD cybersecurity centers of excellence as designated by the National Security Agency. So New York really does, is a big dog here and does punch even, I think, above its weight. Additionally, we do provide resources via the state education department and other bodies to boast, boards of cooperative educational services, probably noted BOCES and other things. And we're obviously expanding the New York Pathways and Technologies program, which partners with education institutions to create cybersecurity curriculum materials for use at K-12 and higher ed. And we are engaging in civil service reform for state agencies, doing such things as expanding the Empire State Fellows Program, continuous recruitment for civil service, and on and on. So there's obviously a lot going on with cyber. And I think that's my last slide. Josh, back to you.
Yeah, so these, same set of questions, just in the context of what Colin described, both in terms of the threats that are out there and the state's approach. Just would like to understand what you see as some of the biggest cybersecurity threats you're facing and the actions that you're taking to mitigate these risks. Does anybody want to, identify any paramount concerns? And of course, these can be concerns in terms of the threats and how you respond to them, but also any of the challenges that you see in the mitigation, in having the right tools, resources, approaches, pathways of sharing information, anything along those lines. We'd like to understand. So I'll open the floor. I'm going to start calling on some of the attorneys that are on the call to speak about risk mitigation and what you see as an increasing concern generally.
Josh, I did have one question.
Go ahead, Dave.
We one of the areas we have is a water quality division, and in that one, obviously, cybersecurity is a big concern, and we get every year from the state guidelines and requirements, extremely stringent ones, which wouldn't be applicable to the telecom industry because you can't run a network and do what the things they ask you to do. But it's a very good document, and I'm wondering if there's something similar for the telecommunications industry that just basically, it gives a lot of recommendations, asks for a ton of information to make sure that you're following the guidelines and stuff like that. I've never seen one for telecom, but we get every year for water, for the water division, we have to do that. So just a question.
Yeah, and probably some others know, and Josh, you probably might know better. Historically, at least my impression is, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not your lawyer, right? So I'm prefacing by saying that. The POTS, the plain old telephone system, has a lot of very stringent requirements related to resiliency and security and other things. And internet telco has fewer. I do think that's changing. There's been some federal movement in the FCC and other places with designations and other things. So I do think that the atmosphere is changing, and you see that with the NTIA grants here. And I think in particular with the DoD, the federal government released the DoD cyber strategy yesterday, I think. And one of the things they called out was learning the lessons of Ukraine, which is that resiliency in internet communications was a key success factor in the defense of Kyiv and kind of the broader success of the Ukrainians in the conflict. So I think that you're right. And I also think that that's changing, and the pace of that change will increase as two things happen. One, the lessons are being percolated from, in particular, the conflict of Russia and Ukraine via the DoD and to the federal bodies that really regulate, regulate this in a material way. And obviously, you heard the governor. We're working closely with the federal government to, you know, to synthesize our set of regulations. And we, you know, via the Public Service Commission and others. So that's kind of my off the cuff. Josh, I don't know if you guys have anything else.
No, I would actually turn Dave's question around. You know, are there, you know, key bulletins or annual guidance that are helpful, or you know, is that something that you know, we should consider developing? Again, you know, my perspective here is this is a you know, the you know, incorporating standards or requirements into these grants is a, you know, key opportunity. We want to do something that supports, not burdens industry, that takes into account small businesses and large. It also, you know, again, our resources aren't limited, but we can make those strategic investments in technical assistance. So, you know, are there, you know, great sources of guidance that we should build on, or is that something that that others see as a need and opportunity? Or again, you can ponder that and then you know, respond when we send out the survey link in a few minutes. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say, as a general matter, one of the things that really I did get a chance to read the DoD cyber strategy. One of the things that really stuck out for me was the Ukrainians had, I think, an appropriate level of imagination for how bad things might be in the event of a conflict, because obviously they've been a nation at war for many years. I think one of the things we, the collective we, and you guys, I think, you know, have mentioned this with the DEC before. We don't want to predicate our impression of how bad things can be based on how bad they were. We want to predicate it on our assessment of the way the world is actually going. So for example, in the climate change, I thought Mark did a great job. You know, it's not like things are going to be as bad as they were. Things are going to be even worse, even faster. And I think in cyber, that's true as well. So in your orgs, you know, it's not that like, well, we have had a couple cyber events and they were major, they were minor, but we kind of were able to muddle on. You know, in the event of significant global conflict, you know, it's not your imagination. In particular, the work that you guys do is hugely critical for not just the state, but for national security. So I do think we unfortunately want to use our imaginations to think, you know, what could the bad guys want to do, especially as I think, unfortunately, global, you know, relations between the significant powers, it doesn't seem like they're on an upward trajectory.
And Colin, I would only add another point that Mark made is that these are, you know, can be potentially intersecting. So we have to also keep in mind about how things may, you know, happen simultaneously by design or chance. So we have to be prepared for how these things may play out on an intersecting basis. So I think those are, you know, two good points. Is you know, providing a potentially framework, making sure we've got a path to sharing information, but perhaps you know, developing that you know, through Colin's office, and also, you know, periodically just imagining, you know, what the future could hold and make sure we're anticipating that. Just you know, go to the next slide. Just want to, you know, again, you know, keep in mind that we are considering what types of requirements New York and the Connect All office may incorporate into any of these grant programs as a condition of receiving any of these funds, and also want to understand, you know, what types of financial resources or tools or other supports we should put in place so that you know, these requirements are you know, are embraced and really increase your confidence to do business in the state and with these grant funds. So any input that anybody would like to share now as part of you know, what requirements we should consider as we, you know, incorporate these factors into our initial proposal for our Infrastructure Act funds. Any other best practices or industry resources that are particularly helpful, or what are some of the key risks that you are mitigating against on a periodic basis?
Josh, this is Glenn Faulkner from the Margaretville Telephone Company. I think the middle mile network is key to resiliency in general. And when we talk about that, both internal as well as incentivizing collaboration where possible with neighboring companies and entities and networks, whether it be public or private, to help enhance each other's network in some sort of a mutually beneficial relationship. And I think that's key for the rural areas that we serve. And another comment just on resiliency, it may not be necessarily network driven. I was at a meeting, a town board meeting, a county meeting last night where there's a lack of cell service and individuals rely on Wi-Fi in the home. And as we deliver fiber to the home, to the premise, unlike the copper POTS lines of the past, we can back up batteries only for so long to keep those networks and Wi-Fi networks operational. And I'm not sure that topic has been 100% vetted. I would like to see, in rural areas, possibly in areas where there's not cell coverage, maybe some consideration for how best to address those residents that are susceptible to losing power and have a fiber connection, which we're trying to deliver obviously to the home. But that does, versus the old legacy copper networks, present some challenges too, to emergency communication at a time of a power outage.
Yeah, it's a great point. The systems are so much more interdependent now than when it was copper.
Yeah, I remember we used to say when the power goes out, the phones start ringing, but I think that now if the power goes out, you can't use the phone. You can't use the phone anyway. So yeah.
And Glenn, I think that you also bring up a great point of how this connects to, again, cellular coverage and people's ability to make phone calls, and the consumers and the residents of New York's general sense of safety and security, and how much this all plays into that as we think about encouraging all residents and businesses to make use of the internet. We want to make sure that we're addressing all of those concerns that they may have, and including if they're going to be moving from copper line to fiber. Other points or considerations, and again, when we send out surveys shortly, please take the time to add in any resources you think we should be looking at, anything that you see as a great tool, any other concerns you're facing as it comes to making sure you have the right tools, systems, insurance or other protections that you put in place to make sure that you're fully prepared. Please share that information with us so that we can incorporate it into our programs. Any other Q&A? I think the next slide is the last slide. So we'll just note that we emailed 2 reports that provide an overarching framework for the 2 topics that we discussed today. And I really just again want to acknowledge our colleagues here in state government implementing the governor's efforts to address these really profound areas of risk that cut across all areas of life, but certainly for broadband deployment. Next slide. We are sending out a survey to help us further gather those insights. can we drop that link in the chat also? And then we'll, I think, email it out. And we're gonna, close a little early, so you'll have time to respond to that now. And as we noted in these forums, we're going to be opening up our digital equity plan and our initial proposal for public comment this fall. So you'll have further chance to respond and weigh in on these items and more. And then we'll begin opening up requests for applications for some of our key grant programs. As always, reach out directly to us, to the Connect All office. We can go to the next slide, with any further thoughts, discussions. If you want to engage directly, if you have additional information you want to share, if there's other factors you think we should be considering, we look forward to that engagement. We appreciate everything, all the engagement that we've had from you and from the entire industry in this process. Looking forward to really putting the rubber to the road of beginning to implement these programs once we get your feedback on the initial proposal and digital equity plan. And also just want to acknowledge the consultant team from HRNA and CTC and the Connect All staff for organizing these forums and making sure they run smoothly. And again, thank you to Mark and his colleagues, Colin in his office, for joining us today and sharing their expertise and for the work they do day in, day out to address these profound areas of concern. All right, thank you very much. And again, please go to that survey link. And how long will it be open for? I don't know that we have necessarily a time frame, except that I would ask that if you can, complete it before the end of this week, that would be of great help to us to again address these factors and how they would provide input into our BEAD initial proposal. Is 5-year plan available? It is in the works for release, and we will send out an email when it is available. Any other questions on any topic? Right, we're free form Q&A now. Okay, well, thank you again, everybody. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the work you do and your workforce to keep the networks up and running. And I look forward to further discussion. Have a great day.